Hit it.
Today's episode of the Left of Boom show, we talk about strike preparation. A little off the beaten path topic for labor relations and contract negotiations. I'm joined again today by Gail Wolfe. Gail and I have worked on a number of different strike prep projects, and there's a lot of great information in today's episode from security and securing your location. How are you going to continue operating during a potential strike? What are the things that you can do to be fully prepared in the eventuality that you might have to face a strike? Also, spoiler, the better prepared you are for a strike, the less likely you are to face one. We also talk about key stakeholders in strikes, how to communicate during a strike. So a number of different really important topics, especially if you've never faced a strike. And even if you have, I think you'll learn some things that maybe you hadn't thought of before. So I hope you enjoy today's episode with Gail Wolfe on strike preparation. Welcome back, Gail Wolfe, to the Left of Boom show. Good to see you.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Good to see you guys again.
Yeah. All right. So today's episode is on the topic of strikes, and more importantly, the how do you prepare for a strike so that you hopefully don't have one. And Gail, we did an episode on sort of being prepared and project managing, bargaining, but at some point, many negotiations get to a point where there's at least the potential of having a strike. And so in today's episode, Gail, we're going to talk a little bit about how does a company, prepare for one and hopefully avoid one. So why don't we just start with that? Like tell me a little bit about sort of, how do you think about getting a company prepared for dealing with a potential strike?
Yeah, I think a couple of questions that the organization will have to ask itself is how do we see ourselves operating through a strike? So if you take out the workers who would be on strike, what does that look like for our operations? And so you can make assumptions of everybody goes on strike, right? Everybody goes out. Or are you willing to allow people to cross the picket line and come into work? So are we going to allow that to occur? And what do we think the cross rate could potentially be? So looking at those numbers. But operationally, I like to do like worst case scenario, better case scenario. So then you are at least preparing yourself. If everyone goes out on strike, how are you going to run your operations? Are you going to bring in replacement workers? Is that an option for your organization? Maybe it's not, maybe it is. So industry wide, I would say, healthcare, right? Replacement workers, nurses are an easier, not easy, but an easier fill to make than maybe some other roles, say in a healthcare organization, or even manufacturing. So in manufacturing, are you going to build up inventory and shut down certain operations? Like, how does this play out so you are prepared? So looking at that talent and, what's that time period? You don't sometimes know going in, right? So we don't know how long it's going to last. So there's a lot of variables that you're going to have to think through as an organization. And what's the tolerance for a strike? So that's going to, because that's going to dovetail into your bargaining and where you are with bargaining. And so for some organizations, they're firm on, I don't want to give more than this. And if that means they go on strike, then we're going to be prepared and we're going to take that time and walk through all the scenarios to make sure that we have the right, people in place and players. So I think strike planning, it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of moving parts. Depends on the industry, depends on your operations. What's your security look like? Do you have in-house security? Are you going to have to hire security? And what even does your physical security look like? Is it prepared if you were to encounter a strike? So there's definitely a lot of moving parts. And so you want to start planning that out as early as possible. So then you can source some of that, because if you are going to source talent and go through a replacement agency, what does that look like? Are you going to, do you need to put that out for bid? Do you have multiple providers on that side that you want to talk to, decide who might be the supplier for your, your staff for that strike? So there are a lot of parts that you need to consider going into this.
Yeah, my head already hurts, but yes, you're right. There's like so much to think about. So why don't we start maybe like at the beginning, which is like why um for like what's the point of the strike? Like why does a union, what leverage do they gain by the threat of a strike or by going on strike? And then why is it important for an employer to, you know, be prepared and hopefully avoid that strike? So maybe just start there real quick.
Okay. Um, so the union, is pulling or saying we're going to go out on a strike, typically to get what they want at the table, right? So you're a lot of times in bargaining. We're not happy with what the employer is providing in terms of, a contract. So this is our only really way to put pressure on the employer that, you need us, right? It's a you need us, we don't need you kind of mentality. So the smoother your strike runs and the less impact you allow a strike to have on your operations, that is counter pressure to the union thinking, okay, we've forced you now to, agree to our proposals to end the strike. So I had a situation where we had started planning a strike way back when the union had just been certified. So we were well into a year of planning for a strike when the strike actually occurred. And it went like, I mean, honestly, I was surprised at how well it went. It was
Mm.
like clockwork. Those replacement workers came in. We didn't miss a beat. We had, things in order. And, fortunately in healthcare, you do get a 10-day notice. So you do have time, that you can hold it at a time. But all the pre-planning needs to be done way like this. It takes a year definitely to plan
Oh yeah.
for a strike. But I think the fact that it went off so well and there was little impact that they're like, okay, why would the employer now agree to our
Hmm.
proposal? Did it financially cost the employer? Yes, right? Because strikes are not free, right? So there is some financial implication there. So I think that's where the balance starts to come in. But I think the more prepared you are, and you can show to the striking workforce that we can manage this, that gets them back to the table faster and getting a little bit more realistic about, okay, what is it that we really want to get in our proposal? So,
Yeah, the dream, right? The dream on their side is that we go out on strike for a couple of days and the employer's like, "Oh, uncle will agree to everything that that you've asked for." And so the way to avoid that dream scenario from happening is what you just said. If we can run the operation without missing a beat, um, then there there is no impact to you being on strike other than you're not getting paid and it's costing you money. Um, but we're going to continue to operate and take care of our customers. That if you're in that situation, and then the best case scenario, Gail, which you just mentioned, is to be so prepared in advance that everybody sees it. And if everybody sees it, what happens then is you might have like a small group of just like the most like the bargaining committee and like the most committed folks on the union side that they might go ahead and walk out anyway, just because they'd feel embarrassed if they didn't. But like the rest of that workforce is going to go, why on earth would I go like not get paid for a week when it's not going to matter. They're totally prepared. And if you take away, if no one's going to go on strike, even if the union calls one, there's no strike. Like, so um you can take away all of that leverage even without necessarily having to implement a plan, as long as it's clear you have a plan and are prepared. I think that's kind of like, to me, one of the key points. So next question is, if you are what are like, you've already mentioned kind of a high level sort of some of those core elements of the plan. What Talk a little bit about, so it's we're very early on, beginning negotiations. Like, what are the most important things to kind of start getting handled first as you're thinking about strike planning?
yeah, I think the things that we tend to not think through in detail and should be thought of is making sure your security. So
Mhm.
whatever it is, it takes some time potentially to nail down if you've got maybe security cameras in areas that don't work, and have been, oh, it's been broken and we've been meaning to get it fixed. Okay, stuff like that needs to be shored up. Our gates, entrance points secured. If you're allowing people to bypass security,
Mm-hmm.
and you shouldn't, shore that up. Make sure people are following the guidelines, badging. If you're supposed to badge a certain way into the building, make sure you're following that protocol. So really tighten up and make sure that people are following the rules that you have established. You're just not enforcing them consistently,
Yeah.
right? So I definitely making sure that that part is done. Have your IT partners in part of the process planning. And I know that's a group that people are like, IT? And I was like, yes, they're so critical in this process. And so IT is going to help you badge people appropriately to have entrance into the building during the strike. Who should be in there, helping you to color code who should be, who should not be, what are the doors, like, okay, how do you access those doors? So security working with IT, and then IT having a running roster of, especially if you're allowing crossers.
Mm-hmm.
So if you decide as an organization, we're going to allow people to cross and come into work during the strike, you need to have IT who has access to systems, because they're going to cut system access for those people who are striking during that strike period. So they can't access your network. And those who are working do need access to the network system. So there's like a lot of moving parts with the IT side to make sure that they are in tune, and vendors. So you probably have potentially in your organization a vendor population. So making sure that whoever is your point person to communicate with vendors, make sure that that person is on point and included in the process. And here will be your responsibility during the strike, and making sure that they're executing that. So there are some of those areas where people just don't, they think, oh, well, HR is going to be heavily involved. Well, yes, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
legal will be involved as well, because they'll be pre-looking and reviewing and looking at risk factors. So you do want legal involved to analyze replacement workers. Is that permitted? What's the licensure that you need? If there's a licensing issue. So there's a lot of legal loopholes that you need legal looking at to make sure that if you're going to use replacement workers, that you're doing it effectively and legally. So I think those are probably some of the issues that I see off the top of my head.
Yeah, great. And I would just add, simple stuff like, where is our property lines? Some employers, are leasing their property. So like the landlord actually is who enforces things like trespass. But figuring that kind of stuff out, as you mentioned, like, some employers, the public can come in and out of the location, but in other employers that's not the case. But how secure is that? Like you said, are you following the security rules? Another thing you haven't mentioned, but is sort of implied in there, is sabotage. So whenever there is a strike, it's not uncommon that the folks, either as they are leaving or maybe even during the strike, they might try to come in and to disrupt operations, and that can be anything from just sort of like protesting or things like that to disrupt operations, up to like actually trying to like destroy equipment, or to prevent the employer from continuing to operate. So that the other reason why security is so critical is to make sure that you avoid sabotage, which is a regular component of strikes.
Um, I've in my
Mhm.
strikes that I've experienced, they hit equipment,
Mhm.
so all the equipment was gone that your workers needed. Plugging up toilets,
Mhm.
flooding floors where you now have to move people around, and operational equipment. But yes, definitely making sure that security is buttoned up and tied up really tight. The one group that depends on what kind of business you are. If you're B2B or B2C, if you're
Mhm.
a B2C, have consumers, you have to think about how a strike plays out for a customer or a patient. So for
Yeah.
patients, I always make sure the call centers, excuse me, are involved in the process of planning, and they have the right scripting, because a lot of times you'll have people from the community calling in, is my appointment still good? I heard there's a
Mhm.
strike. Is there a certain door I'm supposed to enter in through for, access to the building? So definitely thinking through that aspect of what kind of business you are and who could be impacted by the strike occurring at your facility.
Yeah, retail locations, super common to have, same thing, have protesters show up in a parking lot or even come into the store. making sure that leadership understands like how do you effectively get them removed, and they'll try to interact with customers. So what are we going to say to our customers? There's a lot of these moving parts that if you haven't been through this before, you probably wouldn't think of 10% of these. And so it's really wise to have somebody who's kind of got the scars to prove it, to really to be thinking through, okay, in your individual business is going to be like, it's unique, right? So it's not, it's, I can go walk through a building and come up with, wow, if like that would be a place that I would, potentially try to sabotage something. And most employers, they're like, well, you're just paranoid. But it's like, no, if you've been through enough of these, you can see the places where, there would be a choke point that would be like, oh, this would be a good place to try to, slow this operation down. So besides security, what are like some of the other kind of key things, especially to be thinking about early, because it takes time to prepare?
I think the replacement workers is probably the biggest one, in figuring out who are you going to use,
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to use a replacement, agency, and working with that agency from the very beginning as much as possible to prepare, because they're going to ask you questions and you're going to have to pull data together, supply information, so then they could help prep and provide the right head count, especially in, healthcare operations, for example. You have licensure issues. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not like you can just pick an RN from any state and drop them into New York. You have to make sure that you have the right licensure. And then, ICU, you've got certain certifications. Are you putting in the right nurses into the right spots to make sure that you're providing the level of care that you want to provide as an organization, and that you're in some cases required to, depending on the position. So I think, healthcare is probably the one that is the most, that I've worked with, is the most complex because of the regulatory functions of it, making decisions like, are you going to allow elective surgeries to move forward? And here's where the groups that are not part of the strike, but are definitely impacted by the strike, become really, highlighted. Providers who are, surgeons who are doing surgery. Okay, I'm not going to have my RN, my usual nurse, in bedside while I'm performing this procedure. I don't know that I'm comfortable executing that procedure without the RN that I'm used to working with.
Yeah.
A lot of that happens in the course of talking this through and figuring out, what are we going to allow to continue to occur, and are we going to shift work, especially in healthcare operations that are system wide, or you might have even like a manufacturing process that is multi-system, where you could offset work to another location. So that needs to be thought through. So I think definitely, so thinking in advance. And I think vendor and deliveries, think about where you get supplies delivered, where vendors are coming to bring materials to that
Mm-hmm.
you need to operate, and are there alternative places that they could be delivered to if needed, or what's the security around that, and is that vendor somebody who's going to continue to be able to
Right.
supply throughout a strike, because they might have employees who are sensitive, or are sympathetic to, the strike workers, and be, oh, okay, well, we're not going to deliver to that location
They
during the strike.
they might even have a labor contract, right, that says that like they don't have to cross a picket line, and then you need to figure out a way to get them to drop something that's not crossing a picket
Yep.
line.
So I like to have legal actually looking through. So I'll always ask for a vendor list. Who's
Mhm.
all the vendors that are critical that will be at that site? And they can be very long, unfortunately, but your
Mhm.
legal team looking at those contracts, understanding and helping advising who might be a hurdle here, or an obstacle, and can you back stock? So
Yeah.
as you get closer and you think that there could be a strike, can you backstock some products and make sure that those supplies are there and ready, and that you wouldn't have to rely on that vendor
Yeah,
potentially?
and have it stored somewhere, or create a place where you've talked to the vendor and we're like, will you deliver to this location if there is a strike at this other location, and get an agreement on that. Who's a secondary vendor that you could have? There's like a lot of those. One thing you didn't mention, mostly what you've been talking about is kind of like temporary replacement, right? So that's where you are going to hire workers to kind of come in on a temporary basis during the strike, knowing that when the strike's over, like they'll leave. Employers also have a right in certain situations, and we won't get into all the you want to check with your lawyer, so on, about like which of these you can do, but you can also permanently replace. And so permanent replacement means that you're hiring somebody to do that job, and they can keep that job as long as they want, um, not just during the term of the strike, but they would continue to be able to do that job for as long as they want. You have to, if they leave that job, you have to offer the newly open role at whatever time it becomes open. You have to offer that to someone who was on strike before you can fill it from someone outside. But like that is a right that employers have. And so you want to decide way early on, if we were to suffer through a strike, would we temporarily replace or permanently replace? If the answer is permanently replace, then you basically have to have a whole recruiting operation that stood up, in time to be able to hire these replacement workers, or have a plan anyway to bring those workers in, whenever you're starting. If you're not going to permanently replace, then these agencies that you're talking about become like an effective way to do that. And you could do a blend of both. Like you could stand up and start recruiting permanent replacements at the same time that you're using temporary replacements from an agency, for until you get people hired in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what I find kind of the thing that really makes the employer go one way or the other is the role itself. So what is the
Mm-hmm.
skill set that you're
Yeah.
looking for? How readily available is it? Is it something that you can easily, recruit for and hire quickly for, or is there a process? What I find is that the recruiting process takes longer than we think it should,
Mm-hmm.
and it starts to drag out. So that's why I think most employers go with the temporary, just as a
Sure.
matter of course, just because practicality,
Mm-hmm.
it works better. Or they figure out a way how to operate without the workers. Like, okay, do we bring in some of the managers to do some of the jobs,
Yeah.
like to fill in, to do it? You're going to shut down operations. Maybe you're going to do a bifurcated, like we're going to shut down this, we're going to shift these people over here. So it really depends on, that's why it takes so long. Like you have to analyze it for your situation and the hurdles that are in front of you versus like there's not a cookie cutter plan that works for everyone, unfortunately.
I've had a number of strikes, like one totally stands out, but like a number of strikes where management goes in, does the work for a while, and then figures out, oh wow, like we can do this way more efficiently than we're doing it. And now all of a sudden, one of the impacts of the strike for the folks that come back is we don't need as many people because we're going to adjust this operation. I had one where they discovered a like secret break room that had been built, and so it was a big manufacturing operation. So that was a bad day when everybody like lost the place where they would go hide. There was a TV in there. There was a bed. Like it was nuts. So anyway, everyone showed back up, and like the wall that had been put up was gone, and all that was all gone. So anyway, yeah, be careful. Be careful what you wish for when you go out on strike. Your job might be a lot different when you get back. Yeah,
To the before.
yeah. So what what are like some of the other kind of key things around strike planning, strike preparation, that like, especially someone who hasn't been through it before, like this is your first contract negotiation, what are some other like big things they should be aware of?
um, Community. What is the
Mm-hmm.
view of the community of your operations, your organization, your government officials, making sure that they are, kept in the loop and educated on what's going on at the table, what led to the strike. You really want to make sure that those stakeholders are, thought of. You know, each community is different, and the view that the community has of your organization varies depending on your track record, your
Mm-hmm.
history in the community. For some I've worked with, they have this great track record in the community, and it's a large enough community. There's enough diversity that people are scratching their head. Why are these people out on strike? Versus a really small community, more singular employer, maybe doesn't have a great track record with the community, then you get that momentum of kind of
Mm-hmm.
the we're standing, in support of the employees going on strike. I had one strike up north where the union came down. It was, it was UAW, but they came down and it was unrelated industries, but they came down and honked their horns and circled the hospital just nonstop, just
Mm.
nonstop. And that, like understanding that and thinking through like these, they do have support from others, and how does that play out in the dynamic? So I think it really becomes important to think about what are the opportunities that you have with your organization, how you're viewed, what's the communication that you've been sending out, what do people think is going on at the table. So that's where I think communication becomes so critical. You want to make sure those government officials are aware of what your position is, why that is your position, and making sure that they're as informed as possible. They may not agree 100% and not be on your side,
Mm-hmm.
but if you feel like they are read in on the situation, when the union goes and starts to tell their side, it's just natural. They have more information. It's not going to match up exactly with your side of the story, their side of the story. Then that leader, then the government official says, "Okay, hold on,
Mm-hmm.
there's wiggle room here." So I think those are some parts that I don't think people really think through. Communication is critical, like during a strike, making
Yeah.
sure that people are informed. People who are coming to work and who are not part of the strike, you got to make sure that those folks know, hey, it's safe to come to work. We've ensured your security by doing X, Y, and Z. Here's the doors that we need you to go through and utilize during the strike. And I think you have to recognize that some of those people may want to, I want to not come to work because I'm showing support for my fellow,
Mm-hmm.
in this bargaining unit. How is the employer going to respond to that? So you need to think through all those things with your HR and legal folks to make sure that you're giving your leaders in those other departments good guidance on how to handle that. You might have a lot of sick call offs in
Mm.
other departments to kind of show their support of those strikers, workers on strike. So yes, thinking through all those parts well in advance and having a plan is important.
And your communication plan like influences whether there is going to be sympathy by coworkers, sympathy in the community. Like the more you're doing to explain to everybody, like, look, we've put really great offers on the table. Our package is super competitive. There's no reason for for us to be on strike. We should be back at the bargaining table. We're ready, willing, and able to reach an agreement here. Like the more that is the story, the the less likely they're going to get support from all these different groups that you're talking about. So it's a you've said it, but communications is absolutely critical. And also communicating to supervisors and managers and making sure that they kind of understand we have a plan. We're under control. All of those things. Now you mentioned legal. Let's talk a little bit about sort of how legal interplays with a strike. I mean, there's certain things that can happen that'll make a strike unprotected, and where there's kind of like legal um, avenues that the company can take to try to like stop a strike from happening. So maybe just kind of walk through a little bit how legal interfaces with this.
So typically I have legal involved from the very beginning of
Mm-hmm.
stages of the beginning. So, okay, as we're running through, putting the plan together, having them analyze it from a legal perspective to say, okay, that's more risky than this is, or this approach. So making sure that they're always involved from, kind of step one, I think is important. Because replacing workers and agency, like just making sure, and there's going to be a contract, right? So they're going to have to review the agency contract to make sure that with, the verbiage on the contract and how we're going to, pay this vendor. So I think definitely making sure that legal is involved in that entire process, and also looking at, okay, what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. So how far, for example, you mentioned the property lines earlier. So how far up can the employees go? What are those property lines? Legal looking at. And in healthcare, there's some rulings from the NLRB that you got to make sure that you're complying with, in terms of, because people need to go ingress and egress into the hospital. So is there disruption that is, that where you can take some action against the strikers, depending on where they are and how they're kind of, blocking the entrance into a hospital potentially. And I think the other thing is if there is a disruption, how are we going to handle it, and who gets called and notified? So legal will help you identify, like, okay, this happens, and recording, like, okay, are you going to record or take evidence of what happened with the strikers and how they acted during the strike? Is there an incident? How do you want that incident handled? So legal should be pre-reviewing that to say, if this, then this, if this, then this. So making sure that you almost kind of have a diagram. So then your security has no questions on how they're going to handle disruption at the strike line. And I think it really becomes prudent when you have a lot of people who are customers or patients coming in. So it's, that B to C type of situation versus a B to B, because in B to B, you typically have less people from the outside coming in. But if you're a B to C, you're going to have a lot more, issues with that you're going to have to kind of monitor and make sure that legal is part of.
Yeah, great call outs. And then going back to that whole permanent, temporary replacement question, you need, you're going to need an unfair labor practice strike. You cannot permanently replace. So you're going to need legal advice around, have they filed unfair labor practices? Are those unfair labor practices? Do we feel like that they're valid reasons to, convert a strike to a unfair labor practice strike? That's like a critical decision. Like if you mess that up, that is a really, really costly screw up. So like you have to get that right.
And what I would
Things,
say on
yeah.
the point, is not to interject, but I think this is a really important point for employers to kind of monitor and pay attention to, and curtail as much as you can. But they will try to create an unfair labor practice strike out of one that is really not an unfair labor practice strike, right? So that's where, like, to your point, having legal involved. One client in particular, they had, we were bargaining in good faith, and then the employees start to say there's all these safety issues.
Mm-hmm.
So then they're holding these vigils, and there's these safety issues, and da da da. So they created this narrative of, well, that's why we're on strike, is because it's an unfair labor practice or the safety issues ignoring. And so as much as you can, you really do want to pay attention to that, because you're right that you can't permanently replace in a ULP type of strike. So now you've got these situations where you're going to have to use temporary workers.
And it also depends on your industry, right? So like in healthcare, you've already mentioned, but you have to give a 10-day notice of a strike. And if you don't provide 10 days notice, that strike's unprotected, which means that you could theoretically terminate anybody that does participate in that strike, and it would not be an unfair labor practice. So there's a lot of legal components to it. The bottom line to this, we're not a law firm and not giving legal advice, but like you have to have your lawyer giving you legal advice sort of all the way throughout this process, because it's it is a tricky tricky area of law. So what other kind of like main components of strike preparation is there any other components that we haven't covered yet?
I think just making sure that operationally you've really involved the right people from day one, because there's a lot of downstream implications when you start to shift work, change work, how we're going to operate. Having replacement workers, that is a huge lift, because those people have to be oriented to your facility. They have to understand the interworkings potentially of how, where things are in the building, but also who they're working with, their counterparts. So there's a lot of, I think, just how do you orient them quickly, and just the logistics of where are they staying, how are they being fed, are the housing of, we ran into housing issues in one situation. We didn't realize it was the same weekend as some event that was going on in town, and now we had no hotel space for all these people. But we didn't have, the workers, but we didn't have a place for them to stay. And how do you get them then bused from the hotel to the location?
Yep.
So if you're doing replacement workers, that is a super, super big lift. And I think that's where you just need to make sure that you are thinking through with the agent. And a lot of these agencies will help you do that, depending on the industry and what you're working with. But that is a huge lift that takes a lot of time. So you want to make sure that that is done well. So.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Yeah, I think so. A lot of people will think about um, the uh, like this needs to be a big secret. Like our preparation needs to be secret. Um, and I would like you to walk through a little bit, like what reasons might there be to like not keep the plan like completely. Like, I'm not saying that everybody needs to know everything about the plan, but like, what are some reasons that you might want to keep have some of your preparations evident?
I think it puts a pressure on the union that you are prepared, that you are not sitting on your hands and waiting and being unprepared. So they like to catch you off guard. It's kind of like when they drop a petition at Christmas time.
Mm-hmm.
So, they want to catch you off guard as an employer and not prepared. So the more prepared you are and can show and indicate, the less likely I think they are to go, okay, we are now going to stand on the street, not be paid, and it put no pressure on the employer because they were completely prepared for our, walking out. It happened with one of my clients recently. They had a very well, they let the cat out of the bag in a very, proper way that people knew, like they were planning. The managers were going to step in. This is what they had it planned out. They even practiced. They did some
Mm-hmm.
role play to make sure, like, hey, does this work? And the employees, are not willing to go out on strike because, hey, these guys are prepared. So definitely, I think the more that you can, do that in advance, the better off you're going to be because the union then is not going to think, okay, that's going to put the right pressure on them to cave to our proposals that we want.
Yeah, I think it's if you don't show that you're prepared, like how do they know? And even if it's a strike and like you were prepared for it, like it's way better to avoid it. And you also are going to get different behavior at the bargaining table if everybody knows like a strike isn't really a viable weapon anymore. The kinds of offers that you're willing to kind of hold out on are going to be different if you are prepared, and they need to know you're prepared. It can't just all be a secret. um
One
so
thing that we did
yeah,
talk about,
yeah,
I think, kind of going back to the beginning of like strike planning, is figure out early on where will incident command be. So you need a physical space that you're going to operate out of that will be what you would consider incident command, and making sure that the people that you identify to be on that incident command team, that everybody is aware that they're on that incident command team, that here's the expectations during
mhm,
that time period. Like, these are not your normal working hours when you're
yeah,
in a strike. Okay. And in many cases, you are getting a cot and you're living there for a while. So you have to understand, like, as a leadership, individual, that incident command and where's that operate? And then what's the communication look like? So what are you, to your point earlier, I don't know, it just like attorney client privilege, making
mhm,
sure you have privilege around everything. So you start these text strings. What's the protocol? So really identifying your process and protocol for how communications are going to occur during a strike, who's going to be available. So if you want to give people a break, who's going to be on call, who's that primary point of contact. Because if an incident does happen at the site during a strike, and a lot of times this happens, on third shift at night, that's when the incident occurs,
mhm,
who's going to call? Who's the bat phone? So
right.
you got to make sure all thought through well in advance before you get into a strike situation. So
and,
just
and yeah, and this relates to something you said earlier, but like the other thing to keep in mind, and as you're planning and anticipating, like when is this going to happen? Well, they're going to want to pick the time that's going to be the most painful to the employer and probably to your customers, right? So um, you want to be thinking about and a time that you're going to be the least able to implement your strike plan, right? So you should be thinking about when would be the time that they would target. Like we have so like in the hospitality industry, you might look at sort of like when are the big events that might happen, just like the example that you gave. But like if you are a hotel, for example, or a resort, or whatever, you're going to pick like the weekends that are the biggest, most popular weekends, as a place to do your strike because that's going to give you the most leverage. So you want to be, putting yourself in their shoes. Like if I was going to cause the most amount of pain, like how would I do it? That's a good place to start your planning from.
Agree.
Yeah.
And I think the other one that, once you get into the actual strike and it's occurring, you need readouts after every day. So, especially if you have crossers. So, what we would do is we would track the number of crossers that we had for the day, what our labor looked like for the day, what did our production look like for the day, were there any, issues or hiccups that we incurred, just to make sure that each day we had a briefing done, and we did it every shift too. So every shift there would be a debrief to make sure we had all the information and data of what happened during the course of the day. And then we did a full readout for, in this case, it was the board. So, we made sure the board was aware, like, hey, here's exactly where we stand with the strike. So I just think making sure that that's part of your process when you get into the actual strike.
Yeah. I would also just point everybody who's listening to the episode that we did on preparation, like just bargaining preparation. Obviously, all those same stakeholders that are involved in that are going to be involved in if there's a strike. But you want to think through as part of your strike plan, kind of how does that fit into just the whole project management of the of the bargaining. And so you definitely want to check that episode out. What other kind of key takeaways for someone who's dealing with this, especially someone who's dealing with it for the first time? Any other kind of tips or call outs?
Yeah, I think communication is, very, very important during, the strike, to make sure that your employees feel they're in a good place, who are, not part of the strike. So communications, making sure that that team is, on board, helping you to, craft communication, answer questions, getting leadership, talking points if they need them during the course of the strike. The more that you can normalize the process of during the strike, the better off you're going to be, because that's kind of calm the waters of how much striking occurs. I think the other thing that you don't think about is things that depending on like safety, like what's going on, because things happen during strikes that can create safety issues. Bringing gas grills too close to a building. I've seen all kinds of stuff happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so just making sure that you've got security available and ready, and maintenance, rounding regularly, HVAC systems, anything mechanical. Those folks should be rounding every shift multiple times during the shift to make sure no sabotaging is occurring. So I know those sound like, to your point earlier about being a little paranoid, but that stuff happens, and that can crash your system, crash your operations. So you really want to make sure that those things are being, reviewed, walked through, and reported. Where do you report that to? What's the structure and who you're reporting to? That information. Those are probably some of the bigger items. Like I said, each industry, you're going to have some nuances that you're going to have to factor into how you navigate. But I think also we talked earlier about the communication with the community. I think making sure that you have that well prepped and thinking through what could happen if you don't have those people prepped and on your side.
Yeah. You also mentioned in the project management episode, IT, but like that's another place these days that's a prime target for for sabotage. So I think that's a good one to kind of keep in mind. So we'll this is kind of the last area I want to get into, and then we'll conclude. But there's some employers that like they're not going to operate during a strike. Like if enough people go out, or like you just know. I mean, these days it's not uncommon. I mean, there's a lot of times where union leadership doesn't really want to have a strike, but like that they're not going to avoid one because like the rest of the bargaining unit wants to go on strike. And so there's some of these situations that happen where you are going to have a strike. It's not avoidable. You're not going to continue to operate during the strike. What are some tips for a company that's in that situation? That now becomes a big communications issue, and trying to like get the union back to the table and get the employees to kind of understand like you need to get back to we need to get back to the table to try to settle this. Do you have any tips for an employer that is they're kind of looking at their plan? They're like, our plan is if we have a strike, like we're kind of stuck.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the worst situation to be in is if you really don't have the ability to bring in replacement workers or offset, that situation, is to continue to have dialogue with the union about getting back to the table. If you do have, because you could be negatively impacting those folks also who are not part of the union,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we have those players that we have to, factor into the equation as well. So I think that's where the employer really needs to look at that 50,000 foot view and holistically go, okay, what is the best thing and how can we communicate, that we're willing to get back to the table, and that this is not helping anyone. Because at the end of the day, a strike is not good for anyone. It's
Yeah.
really not good for the employees. The employees are losing out. They're losing financially every day that they're standing out on the picket line. They're not being paid. In some cases, they're going to lose their health care coverage. In many cases, that's more important to the employee than the actual paycheck, depending on their, health situation and if they have a family member who's on health coverage. So I think that's where COBRA is very costly. And so that's where I think, that messaging to employees, like, this is not helping you
Mm-hmm.
as individuals. Like, we want to get back to the table. We want to get back to getting an agreement that works for both parties. So I think those are some of the, and if you're looking at a possible, first time contract, or even you have maybe an existing union that is becoming much more aggressive, I think financially, stockpiling as much as you can, cash on hand. What do you need? Like, what does your
Mm-hmm.
financials look like? What can you do to prepare yourself if you're going to, in fact, shut down completely? That's where having enough time to play out the scenarios with your financial and business folks and ops folks, that's beneficial, to your side. So then you can say, how can we come out of this on the other side if we endure a strike and we're going to completely shut down operations? So
Yeah, I think great point. And like, you don't necessarily have to replace people, right? You can build up, inventory that could be sold during a period where there's a shutdown that is already ready to deliver. There's other ways to sort of prepare for a work stoppage besides just like trying to replace the people. So I think that's another kind of key component of that. Well, Gail, this has been, nobody really likes to think about a strike, and strikes are, they're awful, and it's a very stressful time. But I think that you've illustrated, like, if you prepare well, you just work that plan. Often you avoid the strike, or the strike doesn't last very long because it's clear, like, you're prepared. And so I think this has been, really, really helpful to our listeners. So thank you again for joining us. I appreciate it.
great. Thanks, Phil. Have a great day.
Okay, you too.